Welcome to another special crossover edition of Strict Scrutiny meets Legal AF. Leah Litman, Professor Litman, here with Michael Popok. What we want to focus on now is what did we just watch over the last 9 months at the United States Supreme Court?
I can't One of the worst TV shows I've ever seen.
Seriously. And it's going to be renewed, unfortunately, Leah. Oof. They're coming back the first Monday in October. I'll give you the stats. And just so people, I know everybody knows who you are, but Professor Leah Litman, University of Michigan, also the author of a brand new best-selling book, Lawless, How the Supreme Court Runs on Conservative Grievance, Fringe Theories, and Bad Vibes. Okay, I thought it would be a nice idea to take the plane up 5,000 feet and look back down at what we just watched, the wreckage of the United States Supreme Court, just to put it in perspective. Non-emergency docket, 62 opinions over 9 months. I've seen the stats, Leah. I know they're going to shake your head about these. Only 9% of them were on ideological grounds. 40% of them were unanimous. See, everything's fine. Except when you go to the emergency docket, the shadow, what we used to call and still call the shadow docket, 8 out of 10 victories, 80% batting, 800 batting average for Donald Trump, including on major things that matter to us, like the temporary protective status of people, DOGE and Social Security, transgender in the military. Now we've got the ruling about nationwide injunctions, turning, removing that as a tool from the tool bag of federal judges that they've had for decades in places like civil rights violations and constitutional violations. Then you have maybe the side story, the sideshow of whose court is this? We used to name courts like the Kennedy court because he ruled so often. It was the deciding vote. And so it was always somebody in the center or center right. Well, now the center doesn't hold. You've got right. And is this the Amy Coney Barrett court? And what's going on with the Amy Coney Barrett versus Ketanji Brown Jackson thing? Or is that a thing? I want to cover it all with Professor Leah Litman. Hi, Leah.
Hi, that's a lot to cover.
We're going to do it in less than 20 minutes. All right, here we go.
Let's go.
I'll kick it off to you. So what did we just watch? What?
Yeah, so I think on a really high level, what we saw is a court who is willing to bend the law in order to favor certain interests, its ideological allies, while developing the law to give a middle finger to institutions or litigants that it perceives as hostile to its agenda. So this was a major theme in Justice Jackson's writing in a lesser watch environmental case. She noted that the court, by allowing these fuel producers to sue to challenge an EPA regulation, had given some credence to the perception that the court favors moneyed corporate interests. At the same time, she, in her dissent in the Birthright Citizenship case, warned about how the court's limitations on nationwide injunctions were going to fall disproportionately on the poor, the uneducated, and the unpopular. So I think that this was, in some ways, the theme of the term. The court made it easier for corporate litigants to choose where they get to challenge FDA regulations. The court made it easier for regulated entities to choose, when and in what court they get to challenge, final orders of the Federal Communications Commissions and other agencies. At the same time, the court made it harder for civil rights beneficiaries, public benefits beneficiaries to challenge, when a state boots a provider from the Medicaid program. The court made it harder for, again, civil rights litigants to try to obtain nationwide relief against an illegal executive policy. So I think the court shaping the law and access to the courts based on whether they think certain plaintiffs are on the same page as them is, I think, the story of the term.
If the arc of history still does bend towards justice, what are the future Americans and others going to say about this term and Sotomayor, Kagan, and Ketanji Brown Jackson and their dissents, and whether they were on the right side of the angels versus what this MAGA alt-right majority is?
I think that people will look at the ultra-right MAGA majority and say they basically gave a tepid, I don't care, do you, in the face of rising authoritarianism for the Trump administration. And I think people will say Justices Sotomayor, Kagan, and Jackson were trying to sound the alarm as they did so. I think really ever since the big Trump cases reached the court last year, and I'm referring to the immunity decision as well as the decision to put Donald Trump on the ballot, The Democratic appointees have been trying to warn us that this court favors Donald Trump. Justice Kagan sounded that alarm again, in her dissent in the multi-member commission case. This is a theme of Justice Sotomayor and Justice Jackson's dissent in Birthright Citizenship. So I think people will look at the Roberts Six as basically enabling the rise of authoritarianism, and the Democratic appointees as, a small minority who was trying to push back against it as best they could.
Well, let me ask this, because, both of our overlapping audiences are law nerds, and I mean that in a very loving and good way. From your perspective, are dissents, whether read from the bench or just written for posterity, or statements, are they important? And if they are, why?
I do think that they are important. And I think the person I would invoke here is actually Justice Antonin Scalia. He used to say he was writing for future generations of law students, and he would write these fiery dissents that he knew would alienate his colleagues. But he also knew they would agitate and energize the group of future lawyers and future legal professionals who would agree with him and want to fight and feel like they wanted to change the law, the court, and society. And I am hopeful that there will be, a next generation of progressive left-leaning lawyers who are going to grow up in the era of the Roberts Court and read and learn the law, through the dissenting opinions of the three Democratic appointees, and will want to put up a fight and will want to build the kind of movement that can successfully change an institution like the court.
When you said I'm hopeful that there will be a next generation, I thought that was the end of the sentence. I'm hopeful too.
Could have ended it there.
Right. I'm hopeful too. I totally agree with you. I've always, the best reading I think I ever did in law school were the dissents, or the footnotes in things, especially about where we should end up. Here, let's turn for a minute to, I want to get your opinion. The right-wing media and pop media took out of the Birthright Citizenship decision and created a feud between Amy Coney Barrett and Ketanji Brown Jackson, and that Ketanji Brown Jackson was being called an idiot, and then they took it further and said, oh, not that we know what's happening there, but she has alienated herself, Ketanji Brown Jackson, from her brethren, and it's now, it's in the open now with the Birthright Citizenship decision. How did you read that? I know they were reading from the bench too, so that kind of played into that role a little bit. And when they do that, talk about, because the next thing after that, I want to talk about whose court is this?
Yeah, so I do think that there was a sharp exchange between Justice Barrett and Justice Jackson in particular. But I think there are oftentimes sharp exchanges on the Supreme Court between justices who disagree with one another. I mean, again, to go back to Justice Scalia, he said if he ever joined an opinion like the marriage equality decision in Obergefell, he would hide his head in a bag. This is hardly escalating it beyond anything Justice Scalia said.
He went out to lunch and tea with Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Right, exactly. So I don't think that this is something different than we have seen before. To the extent it is the curtness and brusqueness of Justice Barrett, who said, I'm not going to respond, to Justice Jackson, but then also responded to her. So that was something of an odd retort. I think that people tend to play up disagreements among women as catfights. I think the right-wing media and ecosystem, is no exception to that, and is indeed a common perpetrator of that. I don't think, the Justice Jackson dissent and Justice Barrett's response indicates that Justice Jackson has somehow alienated her colleagues. First, had she alienated the Republican appointees, I kind of think, so what, right? It's because she's calling them out and has a point, and people know it, and they don't like being called on their bullshit.
She hurt their feelings.
Right, exactly. Literally the meanest thing you can do to the Republican appointees is to accurately describe what they have done. And she did that. I don't think there's any indication she has somehow alienated her, Democratic appointees. They've joined together, in various dissents. And I think reading dissents from the bench is just a sign of how strongly the dissenting justices feel, and isn't, an indication of any sort of personal animosity.
As a connoisseur of Supreme Court justices, and I've only half joked that the youngest shall lead us, how would you characterize and appraise Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson in her short time on the court in terms of the quality of her jurisprudential analysis and her writing?
Stunning. I think she has vastly exceeded like my already insanely high hopes and expectations for her, as the, former public defender who was joining the court and the first Black woman to join the court. I think she has laid out a vision for what the court could look like, and also has been willing to lay plain criticisms of this court that point out, their jurisprudential flaws, their institutional flaws, and the problems that creates for our system. I think in many ways, she is hopefully, the next frontier of Democratic appointees, who were appointed to courts after Dobbs, right? And realized we are not going to win this war battle project by trying to like make nice and compromise because of what we are up against. And I think she is laying out an alternative vision for how courts in general and the Supreme Court in particular should work. She is also affirming people's concerns about this current Supreme Court. And I think that is very empowering and validating. And I have really appreciated her separate writings and her participation in oral arguments. So yeah, I would just say stunning.
Yeah. I mean, listen, if we ever get the presidency back, I'd love her to be, and Roberts somehow disappears naturally, then I'd love her to be the Chief Justice. I mean, I think that would be.
I literally made that remark in one of my book talks in Washington, D.C. at Politics and Prose. I think maybe it was in response to the question of like, what kind of hope or what do you want to see? I was like a Chief Justice, Ketanji Brown Jackson.
As the same. Like, we may not get a lot of seats, but just give me that seat.
Yeah.
Right. In the future. So that let's transition and segue right into whose court is this? I mean, when you and I were in law school, and of course you teach regularly, I teach here in the TED Talk Meets podcast world. The courts had names because, sometimes, of course, it was named after the Chief Justice, but really organically somebody arose that ended up being the moderate in the center, whether it was Sandra Day O'Connor or it was Kennedy or who's ever court. Mm-hmm. Do we have that anymore? Is that even right? I have a feeling it's not. Go ahead.
No, so I don't think we do. And I think that's a good thing. And I hope that leads us to come up with a more apropos name for this court. I would throw out two monikers that I have heard people say. One is from Sherilyn Ifill, the former president and director counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. She called this court our Reconstruction Court. And it is a reference to the Supreme Court that existed during the Reconstruction era that was hostile to Reconstruction and that dismantled key parts of Reconstruction.
Who was the Chief Justice then? Taney? No.
No. My recollection, but then the second phrase that has been used to describe and analogize, that same court is the redemption court, to signal how, at the time, the Supreme Court was participating in the counter movement to Reconstruction, redemption, which sought to redeem, the South in the eyes of the country and give rise to Jim Crow segregation and the re-empowerment of white Southern, Confederates. And I think this court, should be the neo-Confederate court, or maybe the reactionary redemption court. Adam Serwer has called this the second redemption. And I think that is very much like an accurate depiction of what is happening as far as the justices basically constitutionalizing backlash to all of the civil rights advances of the last 5 decades.
Yeah, I'll go with those. It's Chief Justice Chase was during the Reconstruction period, according to ChatGPT, who was preceded by Taney. It's just such a sad, disheartening thing to be having to label accurately our Supreme Court today, and tying it back to the Reconstruction period. Well, you have a president who said, well, the 14th Amendment is really for children of slaves. That's really all it's for. It's like, well, sorry, what are you even saying now? Let me turn to why. Well, I think I know the answer. This will be almost rhetorical, but I'd like to hear your answer. The exploitation of the shadow docket with the complicity of the United States Supreme Court supermajority has been on full display. They obviously came up with a strategy on the Trump side, probably led by John Sauer and others and Stephen Miller, we're going to stampede the court. We're going to divide and conquer through ideological division by filing these emergency applications, short circuit the process, short track it, 2 briefs, no oral argument. Everybody go to your respective ideological corners because we've got the numbers. Am I summarizing that strategy right?
Yeah, I think it's a strategy that they learned during the first Trump administration.
Yeah.
The acting solicitor general at the time basically pioneered that when it came to the Muslim ban, gambling that the court might be willing to partially allow the administration to implement it without ultimately invalidating it. He was right. And I think the administration learned from that maybe they can get the Supreme Court to do some things quickly on the shadow docket without explanation that they might not want to own completely.
Now, I understand why the 6 are complicit. But my question to you is, why aren't, when some of these cases come up from places where Ketanji Brown Jackson or Kagan or Sotomayor are the first stop on the train, why are they just rejecting the emergency applications and make it a little bit harder rather than go, I'm going to turn it over to the full 9?
This is a court convention that they basically refer all applications, certainly from the federal government, to the full court.
Yeah. So well, we're gonna live and die by that convention, because then when it gets over there, then they're on the losing end of 8 out of 10. I was trying to keep track in the beginning because there was a couple of early losses for them, like in the JGG case and some of these immigration, Abrego Garcia case. But then it's just been nothing but wins, ever since. And so why do you think why is the right-wing MAGA majority, why are they complicit in this? In other words, why are they allowing non-emergencies to be converted into emergencies in order to come up with these procedural/substantive rulings that are in favor of Donald Trump? Why are they doing it?
Yeah, so I think a combination of reasons. One is I think there are at least 3 appointees on the Supreme Court who are basically totally fine with everything Donald Trump is doing.
Yeah.
And I think the reality is that like all 6 of them are probably fine with a lot, or at least some of what Donald Trump is doing. So, this doesn't really require any sacrifice or compromise on their part. And then second is, I think, aside from whether they think like Donald Trump is in the right and they agree with him, I think they are so driven by this conservative grievance mindset complex. This is why it's in the subtitle of my book. But they are so obsessed with this idea that like modern Republicans are always the victims. And so they view all of the litigation against Donald Trump as partially driven by like Trump derangement syndrome. And so they are like the anti-Trump court because they are so predisposed to think that any challenges to Republicans, social and religious conservatives are coming from a bad place and not good faith, that I think that infuses how they view and treat this administration.
Yeah. These constitutional snowflakes. I mean, I get 2 of them. I mean, Kavanaugh was put through the ringer, understandably, for his the allegations of sex abuse while he was in college and all. And of course, we've got the high tech lynching of Clarence Thomas with Anita Hill and her allegations against him, which everybody believes. So I got to get where 2 of them come from. But you're right. It's just this. It's just in their DNA. Yeah. Despite the fact that they've been in control of the United States Supreme Court for the last 50 plus years, right? Yes. We've never known a court that was 5-4 moderate or liberals.
No, never. Ever. Right? Like the Supreme Court has had a majority of Republican appointees for more than 5 decades.
Yeah, it's totally crazy. Let me end it on this. I'm sure you caught Roberts the next day after the term. Oh that's why I love having you on, Leah, because your poker face is exactly.
It does not exist.
It doesn't exist. It's like mine. So Judge Diaz is presiding over the Fourth Circuit conference, timely, and you got Roberts sitting there, right? And he makes a couple of comments. I'm sure you heard the whole thing, but he makes a couple of comments. One of them is, political players have no right to comment about anything the court does. That's one. And 2, if you're on the losing side of an argument, it's just bad. You just have sour grapes and just suck it up. So talk about what is he communicating? What is he trying? What does it show about him and his internal workings?
I mean, it is this obsessive both sidesism
Oh,
and a complete commitment to ignoring the reality of the situation we find ourselves in. He is equating criticism of the court with the vitriol that Donald Trump and his allies have directed at the lower court judges that have ruled against him, precipitating a spike in the threats that federal judges face and the anonymous phone calls and sending, pizza boxes to the judge's house. Newsflash, when you and I do a live stream and we criticize the court, that is not the same thing as Donald Trump posting that Judge Boasberg is a radical left lunatic and corrupt and should be impeached and we're losing the country and that he's siding with terrorists, right? He is catering to an audience that we know, right? Is prone to conspiracy theories, right? And will act on those conspiracy theories in a way that threatens judges. And so it is this insistence on drawing these false equivalencies, that minimize, the conduct we are seeing right now from Donald Trump and his allies, and also trying to deter dissent and delegitimize dissent. So at the same time, they are expanding Donald Trump's power, they are also trying to loosen any constraints on that power, by challenging people who deign to challenge him and the court.
Good people on both sides of Charlottesville, Virginia.
Exactly.
And Robert said, I love his weirdo terminology. Political people shouldn't be criticizing judges, and venting is for losers. And just to show you that the tone, that's what I took away. And then the tone from the top. I just did a video about the Attorney General of Florida, DeSantis bootlicker, who, when he's on the losing end and now found in contempt by Judge Williams down in Florida, it's just par for the course. He posts a photo of the judge,
exactly,
with an Obama-appointed judge.
Yep.
Just did this to me.
Exactly.
And this is now fair game in this vitriol and violent political rhetoric.
Yep.
I just interviewed Doug Jones, Senator Doug Jones.
Okay.
We talked a lot about the rise of political rhetoric that and it's because because Donald Trump gives the permission structure.
Yes.
And not only permission structure, he commands it to be part of his army. You have to act this way.
Yep.
And it's not the Democrats that are getting federal judges in crosshairs or their families killed. We just buried, right, in a political assassination, we just buried, Melissa Hortman and her husband and her dog, off a political assassination just a couple of days ago. And off of that, just to round it out, just to show
a funeral that, by the way, the president and vice president did not attend
or even acknowledge.
Yeah.
Midas Touch ran coverage of it. And then the Midas brothers, got death threats off of covering the political assassination.
Yeah.
Right. Which we all, as a people, this is bipartisan. This isn't red or blue. Right. We just had a legislator and her entire family killed, and nobody should be okay with that. And yet, this is where we find ourselves with the United States Supreme Court that on one hand says, we are the only people who can declare a law unconstitutional, and we'll get around to it in our good time. And federal judges, you stay in your lanes and color in your lines, right? And you come up with injunctions that only fit the case and controversy in front of you and the parties in front of you, even if it means, which Judge Boardman, I don't know if you caught the hearing yesterday, Judge Boardman in her hearing said, let me just get this straight, Mr. Rosenberg. Are you going to be removing babies born in the United States? I just want to hear it. Are you going to be removing babies? And he said, no, but why would she ever believe him?
Right, exactly. Well, then they filed their notice that we are going to start implementing this policy after July 27th. So I guess that means the answer to that question should have been yes.
Yes, which now, if just to round it out, Boardman has to move quicker, move up her briefing schedule, certify that class, and enter that injunction.
Yep. I know. This is the impossible situation the Supreme Court has put lower court judges in.
Absolutely. Whereas, just talk about this political rhetoric, we have a magistrate judge in Tennessee that just put Abrego Garcia into protective custody with the federal marshals to protect him from the Trump administration, who admitted they can't control themselves because they agreed to let him stay in jail until Judge Crenshaw makes his ultimate ruling.
Like, how astonishing is it that like 6 months into the Trump administration, we are now in a situation where pretrial detention is the way to protect your civil rights?
You beg for it.
That is appalling.
Yes.
Yeah.
In a case about somebody who got kidnapped.
Wrongfully expelled.
He's wrongfully expelled. He's now begging to stay in federal detention. Leah Litman, it's such a pleasure to have you anytime over the summer. I'm sure there's going to be more emergency applications. We just had a Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is going to go bad.
Argument in the Alien Enemies Act.
Which is going to go bad when Andrew Oldham, who's trying out for the Supreme Court, said, it's an armed conflict. How could we ever disagree with what armed conflict are we in with Venezuela?
Yeah, he was like, he was asking about Hamas and Hezbollah and like, how is this situation different?
Yeah.
Oh,
so
yeah. That was a wild one.
That's going to be a Supreme Court over the summer vacation, and we'd love to have you back then. Professor Leah Litman, you can catch her most anywhere, but on Legal AF, on Strict Scrutiny. I just saw her on The Daily Show. An amazing book, Lawless. You got to catch it. It's great summer reading. How the Supreme Court runs on conservative grievance, fringe theories, and bad vibes, with a pocket park you're going to have to come up with to put in the back of the book just off this summer.
Yeah, seriously. These guys can't help themselves.
Glad to have you. Have a wonderful vacation.
You too.
All right. Thank you now. Can't get your fill of Legal AF? Me neither. That's why we formed the Legal AF Substack. Every time we mention something in a hot take, whether it's a court filing or a oral argument, come over to the Substack. You'll find the court filing and the oral argument there, including a daily roundup that I do called, wait for it, Morning AF. What else? All the other contributors from Legal AF are there as well. We got some new reporting. We got interviews. We got ad-free versions of the podcast and hot takes. Where? Legal AF on Substack. Come over now to free subscribe.